in our borders.
Hearing there from EU Chief Diplomat Josep Borrell about this new package of sanctions, this comes already after 4 rounds of sanctions that have been introduced since last year in that contested Belarusian election. Now, there is, of course, the risk that this will further inflame tensions at the border, given that the transportation of migrants to the border by the Belarusian regime, by President Alexander Lukashenko, is in part a response to the sanctions programme announced by the EU and imposed in the last few months. So a risk that this could see yet further tensions at the border. But nonetheless, there is a unanimous decision that the EU needs to take tough action at what it is describing as a hybrid attack.
Lucy, talking of those tensions at the border, we're hearing that most of the migrants trying to enter the EU from Belarus are from the Middle East, and Iraq is offering repatriation flights, I hear.
That's right. Iraq has said it will be running 1 repatriation flight today. It estimates that it's got around 570 of its citizens at the border who want voluntarily to return. So it is looking to transport people out of that area in order to be repatriated in Iraq. We know that there have not since August been direct flights from Baghdad to Minsk since August, but that people have been flying through countries like Turkey in order to access the Belarusian capital, and then being transported by third parties to the border. Meanwhile, of course, those devastating scenes at the border, thousands of people trapped in freezing conditions, faced with a fence in front of them and hundreds of Polish troops, a situation that is becoming increasingly dire. So we understand that it is likely that other countries, such as Afghanistan, who also have their citizens at that border, may also be looking to transport people and repatriate them back to their home countries.
Lucy in Brussels, thank you for that update. Europe is once again at the centre of the global pandemic after cases soared more than 50% in the last month. Countries are bracing for a winter of harsher measures, while Austria has already taken action. It's placed millions of people that aren't fully vaccinated into lockdown. CGTN's Johannes Peschberger in Vienna.
These measures concern about 1/3 of the Austrian population, the non-vaccinated. They are only allowed to leave their homes for work or for going to the supermarket or to a pharmacy. Everything else is closed for them. Restaurants, shops, museums, theaters, everything. And these measures are necessary according to the government because Austria has one of the lowest vaccination rates in Western Europe and at the same time one of the highest COVID-19 infection rates. So the Austrian Chamber of Commerce has estimated that about 35% less customers will be at Austrian shops at the retail sector. So they will lose a lot of sales revenue. And I have spoken with some protesters because not everybody obviously is happy about these new measures. They have set up a protest camp in the inner city center of Vienna, and they think that these measures are like a regime. They talked about the dictatorship. So there's a lot of protests going on. A big demonstration has been announced by one major Austrian party. So not everyone is happy, but there are a lot of people that are now being pushed to vaccinate. Vaccination numbers have risen a lot over the past days. I was at one vaccination center at St. Stephen's Cathedral, and the waiting lines were several hundreds of meters long.
Well, that was CGTN's Johannes Peschberger in Vienna. Germany's coronavirus infection rate has risen to its highest level since the start of the pandemic. The number of people per 100,000 to be infected over the last week rose to 303 from 289 a day earlier. The 3 parties currently in talks to form a new coalition government say they'll reveal new proposals to tackle the spread of infections. Another 23,607 cases and 43 deaths were reported on Monday. The Chinese mainland has reported 52 new COVID-19 cases. Northeastern Yangong province has seen the most transmissions, with 25 cases reported in the city of Dalian. Officials say it's now clear that the center of the latest COVID outbreak is a college town in Shanghai. At least 9 rounds of testing have already been conducted in the town, and thousands of students have been transferred to centralised quarantine facilities. Jury selection begins this week in the sex trafficking trial of Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell, the daughter of late media tycoon Robert Maxwell, has pleaded not guilty to charges that she groomed underage girls to have sex with financier Jeffrey Epstein. She's due to go on trial at a US court in Manhattan on November the 29th and faces a maximum of 80 years in prison if found guilty. 4 men have been arrested after a taxi exploded outside a hospital in the UK city of Liverpool. Police have declared it a terror incident and say they believe they know the identity of the alleged bomber who was killed in the blast. It comes amid reports the taxi driver helped avert a more serious disaster. Michael Voss reports.
对啊，主播在听新闻，一边看一边听。
Hospital remained cordoned off with a strong police presence on Monday, with forensic teams on site sorting through the wreckage. The explosion killed the passenger, while the taxi driver is being hailed as a hero, amid reports that he felt something was wrong, jumped out of the vehicle and locked the passenger in. The driver is recovering from non-life-threatening injuries.
It does look as though the taxi driver in question did behave with incredible presence of mind and bravery, but I've got to say this is something that is an ongoing investigation.
It is not clear what the motivation for this incident is.
Arrested Sunday night in the Kensington district of Liverpool and are being held under the Terrorism Act. In a separate raid, armed police officers cordoned off another street and are searching the house in connection with the explosion. Several residents living nearby were evacuated, with others told to stay indoors.
We've heard police shouting at people to stay inside if they've tried to leave the house. We've heard them just get ordered to stay inside, basically.
Police are still guarding 2 of the addresses they raided on Sunday. A 4th person has now been arrested, though no one has yet claimed responsibility for the explosion. Michael Voss, CGTN.
China has hit back at criticism that it helped water down the final text of the Glasgow Climate Pact. COP26 closed on Saturday with a deal that targeted fossil fuels for the first time. But last-minute negotiations saw a clause calling for coal to be phased out, weakened to phase down. Summit President Alok Sharma says China and India owe an explanation over the change in language. But China says it's developed countries that need to take the lead.
We encourage developed countries to take the lead, to stop using coal, and at the same time we encourage them to provide adequate funding, technology and building support for the energy transition of developing countries. What we need is not only a slogan, but also concrete actions.
Carla Gillenport is the Vice President for International Strategies at the Centre for Climate and Energy Solutions. Thanks for joining us. Look, you were at the conference throughout. I know it wasn't your first COP26. What do you think the legacy will be?
Well, I think that's a good question, and we may not know the answer to that for some time after Glasgow. But I think coming out of COP26, we really have the building blocks to transition for what for a number of decades has been a focus on zero-sum negotiations to one where there's a focus on implementation. And I think Glasgow has set the possibilities for that to happen.
Critics are calling it the Glasgow get-out clause, meek and weak. And others say a bridge has been built between good intentions and measurable actions. What do you think?
Well, I think expectations going into Glasgow were very high because of the increasing impacts around the world and also the latest stark assessment from the IPCC. But I think there's also a misunderstanding of what COPs can deliver. They are not themselves the place where ambition is delivered, but they rather reflect where we are, and if the conditions are right, they can push ambition a little bit further. And I think given that and the challenges of negotiating during a pandemic with no in-person negotiations for almost 2 years, I think the outcome including, as you mentioned, references to phasing down fossil fuel subsidies as well as coal. So I think in that sense it's a success, but eyes will now be on all countries, particularly the G20, to implement the promises that they've made.
All countries who have general elections coming up and might have been thinking about votes rather than about future generations. You say that this has been impactful, so what are we going to do about it? Is it now up to the individual, or is there still a role for governments to talk about it?
I think that's a very good question, and there was a very impassioned intervention by the Minister of Tuvalu, one of the lowest lying countries in the world, saying that politicians really need to look beyond the next election. And I think that's a real sign of leadership. Can you look beyond the next election to future generations? But also Greta Thunberg tweeted today that people should stop looking at COPs for hope, but actually create hope themselves. And in that sense, I'm very optimistic because things are changing and more people are tuning into the fact that we do need real world ambition on climate. And without that common consent, politicians don't have much room to maneuver. But I think things are moving in the right direction.
It's not just about ambition, it's also about money. So what about who should pay vulnerable nations for loss and damage from global warming? I mean, how has the climate justice conversation, if you like, moved on?
I think that's an important factor. And I think developed countries really haven't understood fully the symbolic nature of the promise to 100 billion a year. While that is a drop in the figurative ocean of what's needed to actually transition to climate resilience and to deal with the impacts of climate change, the symbolic value and also the real world value to the most vulnerable is really important. So the fact that that hasn't been met is disappointing. But to actually solve the climate crisis, we really have to shift the trillions, as it's called, and align the global economy with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And a work program has been agreed to develop that beyond 2025. So that's going to be really important going forward.
Well, let's hope that that roadmap hasn't been developed with invisible ink. Catherine Gml, thank you very much.
肯定有袜子呀。
Still ahead.
我今天不是穿的那个黑丝吗？不是电影，是听的那个英文频道的，听新闻。
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw. The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
we can try out the wild, crazy ideas. Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming. I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation. We should all be very patient when we're trying to save the world.
昨天直播没有来吗？昨天的那个直播比较现代着装啊，今天稍微古典一点。昨天有谁在啊？昨天。
Welcome back. Reminder of our headlines. EU foreign ministers meet to agree tougher sanctions on Belarus, and the airlines it accuses of creating the border migrant crisis. Austria puts 2 million people that have not been fully vaccinated in lockdown as COVID infections spread. And UK anti-terror police investigating an explosion in a taxi outside a Liverpool hospital that killed one person. China's President Xi Jinping will hold a video meeting with US President Joe Biden in the coming hours, the first since Biden took office. It follows 2 phone calls between the leaders this year, but comes at a time of fraught diplomatic relations on issues like trade, technology and Taiwan. Across to Beijing and our reporter Li Jianhua. Good to see Li Jianhua. Trade, the pandemic, climate change, what will be discussed?
Yes, Julius, the online meeting comes at a time of fruitful relations on issues like trade, technology, and Taiwan. As for the agenda, there are already some assumptions. Taiwan is likely to be on the top of the agenda given the simmering tensions of the island. The U.S. has repeatedly said it supports the One China policy, but the White House stressed there has been no change in the U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity on whether it would defend Taiwan. The Chinese Foreign Ministry this afternoon said the One China policy that the US now holds has been distorted and is different from the consensus that China and the US reached when China-US ties were first.
昨天主播直播的时候已经时间挺晚的了。
The two countries are still in a trade war since 2018, despite round
所以等你刚上线的时候，那肯定估计你也12点半了吧？昨天看主播12点半下线的。
If it doesn't change its trade practice, China wants a free trade and the US trade tariffs on its exports to be lifted, of course. And technology for sure will be on the agenda. Since the trade war happened, the US has slammed sanctions on several Chinese tech companies, including the tech giant Huawei, which is also the 5G leader, drone maker DJI or Dajiang, and surveillance firm Hikvision. So besides the trade war, we're looking at a tech war between them. Security in the Asia-Pacific region could be another topic. Under the framework of AUKUS, we know Australia will have nuclear-powered submarines, so China is really worried that this is a move against its military presence in the South China Sea. And of course, pandemic operation will be on the agenda, given the virus still rampant across the world. There will be
昨天主播穿的就是长靴啊。
and settle, Juliet.
Yeah, Jianhua, you know, it's good to talk, but do we really expect anything concrete to come out of it?
Juliet, I'm not sure. I'm sure that both sides don't want to get their hopes up at this point. And ever since Joe Biden took office, we've thought that the new U.S. administration may not continue to take hard lines against China like his predecessor Donald Trump's. But remember Biden's first address to Congress, he said China and some other
这2年不都挺流行这种复古风的吗？
should maintain its leadership role. So what's for sure is that Biden would take his priorities against China and be very candid with President Xi this time, according to the White House. And Biden is confronted with many internal problems, and we know the rising unemployment rate and inflation, also his supporting rate is going lower. So he may need to shift the public's attention at this point. And if we look at the high-level talks of the past year, the two sides had some heated exchanges, especially the face-to-face meeting in Alaska, which was rare.
80年代那种旗袍应该是更花哨一点，都是那种大花底儿，然后桑蚕丝的那种面料会多一点，要么就是那种布的格子状的。
and doesn't hope China will overtake this role as the world's leader. What China wants is mutual respect, urging the US not to interfere in China's internal affairs. And China aims
你都没有加主播的粉丝牌，在这说啥呢？
major power relationship is based on mutual and reciprocal respect and should be a new normal. So based on the high-level talks in the past year, we can see they're willing to talk and work on differences, but it takes time, Juliet.
It does take time, Jianhua. Thank you very much. Sounds like those talks will be intense. Beijing has a new stock exchange with a focus on what are called the little giants. Trading opened on Monday with 81 companies. And this comes amid a crackdown on tech companies in China, which spooked investors, knocking more than $1 trillion off the value of Tencent Holdings and other tech giants on Wall Street and the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. A Harvard-educated entrepreneur whose anti-corruption party was formed only weeks ago is emerging as Bulgaria's hope to end political deadlock. The We Continue the Change party is in the lead, with 25.4% of the vote, based on 61% of ballots counted from Sunday's election. Linda Kennedy reports.
In just 2 months, a new anti-corruption party has garnered support across Bulgaria. At its helm, a Bulgarian politician being compared to Justin Trudeau and Emmanuel Macron. Kirill Petkov was educated in the US at Harvard and founded a company that makes vegan probiotics. As caretaker economy minister earlier this year, he became one of the first politicians in Bulgaria to expose alleged misuse of public funds. With another Harvard-educated minister, he quickly formed We Continue the Change, which looks set to win around a quarter of the votes cast in this Bulgarian election. Petrov is the great hope for those opposed to ex-Prime Minister Boyko Borisov, who faced huge street protests in 2020. Borisov's decade-long rule ended with Bulgaria's first election this year in April, amid public anger over his failure to crack down on corruption. His centre-right party is also set to secure around a quarter of the votes.
频道是那个 CCTN， 不是别的啊，也不是电影，很多人以为主播在看电影。
He's tipped to win a second 5-year term. The turnout this time was a historic low of
没有加粉丝牌的，赶紧加个粉丝牌啊！
and coronavirus infections that have overwhelmed hospitals. Bulgaria is the least vaccinated EU member state, with just 23% of people vaccinated. Tough coalition negotiations lie ahead to create a workable government. 4 parties are needed for a coalition. And at the elections earlier this year, in April and July, no coalition could be agreed, which is why this election was held. Kirill Petkov says that his party is open to dialogue and compromise, but that he will not renege on his promise to overhaul the judiciary and clamp down on corruption. Linda Kennedy, CGTN, Budapest.
Millions of Afghans could face starvation this winter, according to the United Nations. As well as food shortages, the cost of fuel has soared in a country heavily dependent on diesel, wood and coal. The situation is even more bleak for the many people displaced by conflict.
个儿比较高，大概12厘米。
Abdul Hadid Aris reports from Kabul.
Winter is looming and the farmers are concerned about how they'll get through it as they grapple with an unprecedented increase in the cost. The high prices are having a big impact, especially on those who run central heating systems.
The money is blocked. Banks have not returned to normal. That's why traders can't import fuel. So fuel prices have increased. The price of both diesel and petrol is high.
We use a central heating system in this apartment. The fuel is expensive. 1 liter is sold at 80 AMM. Problems are rising with the winter approaching fast. Also, people say the coming winter will be very hot.
The change in regime has affected almost everyone in some way. Many people have lost their jobs and businesses, and they are now unable to feed themselves, let alone buy wood or fuel to heat their houses.
The market for wood is the economy has been devastated, and the market was better last year. But this year, people have become so poor that they can't buy wood and coal.
Some of the most vulnerable people in the capital are internally displaced people who are still living in tents. Most of them don't even get 1 meal a day. In addition to worrying about basic needs, they are extremely apprehensive about how to meet their eating needs this winter, a problem that has not yet been addressed.
Because of the cold weather, I put the 2 available blankets on my husband, who's paralyzed, and we spend the whole winter without any coverlet at night. Everyone here has nothing. A few children in this camp have died because of cold weather.
The Taliban authorities say they have plans to relocate the IDPs by encouraging them to return to their home provinces.
We have talked with various NGOs to address the needs of IDPs, and we have arranged things for the winter, such as warm clothes and other items. When IDPs move to their home provinces, we will send a list of IDPs to their respective Provincial Directorate of Repatriation and Refugees, through which the IDPs will receive assistance such as winter clothes and anything else required.
Despite the Taliban promising that things will return to normal, the skyrocketing fuel prices are worrying citizens. The Afghan people, especially internally displaced persons, are hoping the Taliban will step up and control the price of commodities and intervene to aid those in desperate need of assistance. Abdul Hadi Dari, CGTN, Kabul.
The headlines again. EU foreign ministers meet to agree tougher sanctions on Belarus and the airlines it accuses of creating the border migrant crisis. Austria puts 2 million people that have not been fully vaccinated in lockdown as COVID infections spread. And UK anti-terror police investigate an explosion in a taxi outside a Liverpool hospital that killed 1 person. And that's the world today. Thanks for watching. We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, on Freeview. We're back with more news at the top of the hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, You're orbiting here in London. Goodbye.
在听那个英语频道的一些国际新闻。主播还有再过15分钟下线啊。
On today's World Insight, on the eve of a summit between the presidents of China and the US, what's the state of relations between the world's top economies? The most pressing matters. Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. This is a live show on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. Chinese President Xi Jinping will meet with U.S. President Joe Biden via video link on Tuesday morning, Beijing time. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said the two presidents will exchange views on ties and issues of mutual concern. The summit is a chance for both leaders to cooperate on global issues and put relations back on track. Before we get down to a discussion about it, let's take a look at this.
The highly anticipated talk will be the third engagement between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Joe Biden since the U.S. president took office in January. The talk will happen days after both countries issued a surprise statement of cooperation on climate change at the COP26 in Glasgow, both pledging to speed up action in reining in greenhouse gas emissions. China's foreign ministry spokesperson stressed the summit's importance not only to bilateral ties, but also international relations.
We hope the US and China will meet each other in halfway by enhancing dialogue and cooperation, effectively managing conflicts, and appropriately handling sensitive issues. We hope the two countries will explore ways of mutual respect and peaceful coexistence and push China-US relations back on the right track.
The two sides have had some high-level talks earlier this year, including the phone conversation between the presidents in September, which is a, quote, candid, in-depth, and extensive strategic communication and exchanges. And there are also some ministerial meetings. The first face-to-face meeting between top Chinese and U.S. diplomats in Alaska this March opened with a heated exchange.
对啊，在学习英语啊。
Chinese State Counselor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi and U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman met in Tianjin. In October, the Director of the Office of the Foreign Affairs Commission of the CPC Central Committee, Yang Jie-cher, and the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met in Zurich. Also in October, Wang Yi met with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Rome on the sidelines of the G20 World Leaders Summit. As the two largest economies in the world, both China and the U.S. are whether in some domestic issues, like the sixth plenary session of the 19th CPC Central Committee, charting China's future development, as well as the control of inflation and the pandemic in the U.S. This upcoming meeting between the two leaders is expected to be an equal, mutually beneficial exchange that could put relations back on track.
Yes, the relations between China and the U.S. and the upcoming U.S.-China President's meeting, we are joined by three panelists. Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow with the Center
主播还有10分钟下线啊。
Security and Intelligence and Director of the Research for Foreign Policy with the Brookings Institution. Good to see you, sir. Long time no see, I have to say. In Memphis, Dr.
Nice to be back.
Good to see you, Dr. Joseph Gregory Mahoney, a professor of politics at East China Normal University. Good to see you as well, sir. Last but not least, in Shanghai, Shen Dingli, professor with the Institute of International Studies of Fudan University. Professor Shen, good to see you. So, a lot of attention on this meeting. Nobody is expecting it's going to achieve a miracle, but certainly people are feeling some hope on it. But how much, Mr. O'Hanlon?
Well, I think you summarized it correctly. We should have lots of pragmatic, low-key conversations and meetings. I like very much the setup package that underscored the number of times there have already been high-level meetings, and also conversations between President Xi and President Biden. I like the fact that your colleague pointed out that the meeting in March was not always that easy, and there were some heated exchanges. I would rather see a lot of realistic dialogue where there are differences of opinion that are articulated, and there's no happy talk. There's no pretense that somehow we can rescue the entire relationship with one chummy phone call or a visit to the Olympics or something like that, but rather that we continue to focus on those issues that are the most difficult and the most dangerous, including, for example, the fraud issue of Taiwan, but also issues of intellectual property rights, also issues of collaboration and economic development around the world. So I like this kind of pragmatic, business-like conversation.
I see. Business-like conversation. What should be on that laundry list? Since Mr. O'Hanlon already given his, what about for you, Professor Shen from China?
Well, I agree with Michael that we may not play high hope for the outcome of the meeting, but I do have my personal hope the meeting would start more meeting, not necessarily to start a good relationship, but at least to reduce the damage, to control the damage, to prevent more damage from happening. And this is more likely through the talk than without the talk.
All right, so that's damage control and prevention of further damage. Is that going to be the assessment, Mr. Mahoney, that you can give to the upcoming meeting?
I'm a little optimistic, although I'll temper it somewhat. With the COP26 emissions deal that we saw, the surprise deal we saw between the U.S. and China, given the fact that I think U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai sort of opened the possibility that we'd see some evolution on trade this year, and the simple fact that we're having a summit, I don't think that President Xi would agree to participate in a summit that wasn't going to produce some positive, tangible results. I don't think he's interested in the sort of posturing that we saw between Biden and Putin earlier this year. So I think that we're going to see some positive movement on trade at least, and probably not much else, maybe a little bit on technology.
Well, we'll see. Since you talk about the COP26, let's take a look at what kind of foundation can it lay, at least good feelings can it lay for the two presidents meeting. In a surprise quote-unquote announcement at the COP26 summit in Glasgow, China and the U.S. Have agreed to do more jointly on the climate change issue. The world's two largest economies called for establishing a working group in carrying out the Paris Agreement, which seeks to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. China and the U.S. have also agreed to improve policies on balancing electricity supply and demand, and also on pursuing solar storage and other clean power solutions. They have also been agreeing to work together in cutting methane emissions. The two sides have made, amid these promises, amid the tensions over trade, human rights, and geopolitical issues. So you can see there is a lot on the agenda, but how much, Professor Shen, do you think this is really helping to create a good atmosphere?
Yes. Actually, the bottom line is to control damage. But what if more than control damage? The two presidents can achieve more positive outcome. For instance, President Xi Jinping spoke to the UN General Assembly this year by stating China commits not to build more coal-burning power station outside of China. And this would help not only China can reach a carbon emission peak by 2030, China would not contribute to more carbon emissions through its own building up of those coal-burning kind of electricity generation power. And also, the U.S. seems to push China. What if China can advance the target year 2030 to 2029, 2028? China would reach carbon emission peak. China has not agreed. China says, you cannot expect me to cooperate while you push me on Xinjiang, Taiwan, South China Sea, and Hong Kong. But China does release the statement with the U.S. in Glasgow on strengthening bilateral cooperation on carbon reduction by stating, it seems to me
还有5分钟下线啊，主播。
2025, China would start to reduce the coal burning inside China. And that must help China to achieve the carbon emission peak before 2030.
This is a very interesting example, Mr. O'Hanlon. Of course, you're a security expert, but looking at this case study in a way, that China certainly is not going to make the commitment with the pressure coming from Washington, but China is willing to make a commitment on its own initiative. So this is a very interesting example, and on that initiative, China and U.S. can work together. This brings us to really a long-time discussion since earlier this year about the so-called the position of strength, which is the phrase being debated between China and the United States for such a long time. So, Mr. O'Hanlon, tell me more about from what kinds of basis do you think the two presidents should talk to each other so that they can at least guarantee some success?
Well, I like the way Ding Li put it, but I guess one example I would give, just in terms of the overall takeaway for both countries and their publics, is to remind people that these are two serious countries that are trying to make the world better, first and foremost for their own people, but also for everyone on the planet. And that's different from, let's say, Stalin's Soviet Union. It's certainly different from aggressive powers in Europe before and during the World Wars. I think China and the United States actually have mutual respect and do have more mutual interests than they have mutual differences. And in fact, I believe it's important to keep sending that message to our publics, because sometimes other messages get sent. For example, I'll be critical of my own government here. As you'll recall, both the Trump and the Biden administrations have accused China of genocide towards the Uyghur population in Xinjiang province. I would criticize China for some of its policies there, but they're not genocide. And that's a very dangerous and loaded term to use. We don't want to demonize each other. We want to remember that both countries are trying to be serious about the way they govern. They may have different perspectives, different values to some extent, but they're both trying to improve the lives of their own people, and they're trying to do it in a generally collaborative way. We have to keep sending that message, because we don't want images of demonization to dominate either side's view of the other.
Point taken, Professor Shen. Of course, even on the issue of the treatment of Uyghurs and the minorities, there are different understandings about China's practices, and China has some work to do to communicate with the rest of the world about that. But one thing is for sure, there has been a lot of misconceptions, sometimes even man-made misperceptions being created outside China toward China. So, Professor Shen, to what extent, once again, going back to the meeting between the two presidents, that they should be able to communicate despite of opinion differences, so that they can guarantee to lay some foundation for further discussions, which will do good for both countries and certainly for the rest of the world as well.
Recently, Mr. John Thornton, who has founded the Thornton Center for China Study at the Brookings, has visited Xinjiang. Even though the White House was unhappy for his visit, but he insisted that he wanted to visit. I think that's very good. Through on-site visit, he may understand better that China has room to improve.
还有1分钟下线。
To strike against those radical force, those totalitarian force, but China's action cannot be described in any sense by the term that genocide that Michael has stated. There is no such a thing of genocide, but China's action can be improved. So this is the thing the two countries should improve their communication. China should not only tell, I'm not doing that. China should also invite more American friends to Xinjiang to have the on-site visit and to facilitate the visitation. And meantime,